All right, welcome back, everyone. We have a special episode tonight, as we've been saying. We're going to have some guests on to talk about the Constitution, the attacks on the Constitution, where it's all going. And so with this special Q&A, we're going to be talking about some of the guests who were in America Rewritten, the documentary we just published on Epoch TV. And we're going to be going into, I guess, kind of why we're all talking about the Constitution, why it matters. Now, as usual, folks, if you have questions, leave them in the chat. We'll try to get to them. And we're going to invite on some guests now. We're going to have on, it's going to be Kevin Roberts. He's CEO of the Texas Public Policy Foundation. Kevin, real pleasure having you on. We have Rick Green, former member of the Texas House of Representatives and founder of the Patriot Academy. And we also have Dustin Bass. He's the host of the Sons of Liberty. All of you, it's wonderful having you on. And so, folks, again, if you have questions for our guests, leave them in the chat as well. If you want to direct a question to one of them in particular, note in the chat, and let's get started. So first off, we're going to talk about kind of the assaults now taking place in the Constitution. I mean, is the Constitution really under attack? Now, I guess to start with this, Kevin, I'm curious if you can talk about what you're seeing from your angle, maybe when it comes to free speech.
Well, Josh, thanks for having me, and hello to the other guests. We're going to have a good night tonight. Look, it's hard for me to say this without it sounding like hyperbole. But I assure you, leading the largest public policy group outside DC, being a historian, that these are just the facts. When it comes to free speech, almost everywhere we look, if you're center right, especially, we're being assaulted. I offer an example that's only hours old. Early this afternoon, the press secretary for the White House, Jen Psaki, conceded that the White House was working with Facebook to flag posts that were deemed misinformation, perhaps inflammatory, about the Wuhan coronavirus. I might submit, and I mean this only slightly tongue-in-cheek, if we're going to be doing that, perhaps we ought to be flagging any comment by Dr. Anthony Fauci, who's been filled with misinformation for 18 months. The point is, whether it's being in cahoots with Facebook, with Twitter, with other social media channels, the federal government, and I mean this with just great sincerity and honesty, is doing precisely what the federal government was doing in the late 1790s when John Adams pushed through the Alien and Sedition Acts, making it illegal to comment negatively about the federal government. This is what we're up against, and it's really important that all of us have the courage to fight back against it.
Now, the other big thing with this is, of course, gun rights. And a lot of people have been talking about, well, red flag laws and things like this. Rick Green, I'm curious if you can talk to us about what you're seeing on the assaults against gun rights.
Yeah, Josh, hey, great to be with you, man, and honored to be with Kevin and Dustin, great guys, and I love having a Texas panel here tonight. But listen,
all Texans, yeah.
Yeah, you got to talk gun rights if you talk to a bunch of Texans all in one evening. But no, first of all, I want to echo what Kevin was saying, because I think when you look at what happened throughout the COVID crackdowns, it's hard to find a part of the Bill of Rights that wasn't violated by some level of government. It's been a shameful year for the Constitution. And, you know, on gun rights, maybe not as much of an attack under the COVID crackdowns, but a constant attack from the left. But now the COVID crackdowns are leading to Andrew Cuomo now in New York using emergency powers. I mean, we warned about this back in March and April and May when these governments started claiming this emergency powers, something that we've never done before, applying what you would do with a hurricane when it wipes out a neighborhood to now a pandemic statewide. And Cuomo is now doing the same thing with guns. He's claiming that we're going to do the same thing with the emergency powers we did with COVID in New York. He's going to do that with guns. Now, that's not new for Cuomo. I was taking him on 20 years ago when he was trying to blame gun manufacturers for crime, and we finally defeated that effort. But it's an incredibly dangerous path. There's no doubt there are those who blame the guns for crime. In fact, you'll hear Cuomo and others constantly say gun violence. It's actually just violence. It's murder, whether they use a gun, a knife, a rock, or a car. And the Second Amendment specifically protects what the founders called the first law of nature. So this was something that they found in the laws of nature and said, you couldn't give this up to government even if you wanted to. Founder after founder said that. It is definitely under attack. Former Supreme Court justices wanted to get rid of the Second Amendment. There's a big movement for that. And folks that want to keep their Second Amendment rights and be able to have the ability to defend themselves in the moment and also to defend against a tyrannical government, better stand up and defend the Second Amendment and the entire Constitution.
Yeah, thank you. Now, Dustin, the other big one, of course, is the freedom of belief, and we saw a lot of this during the COVID lockdowns. Dustin, I'm wondering if you can tell us what's happening right now with the attacks on freedom of belief.
Well, I mean, it's been very interesting over the past year, the shutting down of churches, and our First Amendment, like Rick and Kevin were talking about, and it's great to be on, like they said, a Texas panel. This is fantastic. I really can't think of a better way to go about this panel than getting some guys from Texas. But the First Amendment says Congress shall make no law establishing respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. What's interesting is that it says Congress, so seemingly governors and mayors, judges seem to be thinking, I guess, well, since we're not Congress, we can go ahead and shut down churches. It is interesting. There's always going to be a fight against religion. And over the course of history, it's always been, the government and religion being together. And so with this being separate, it is the government coming up against the churches. What scares me more than anything is how the churches and the pastors and the organizations responded to the lockdowns and the shutdowns. It's not so much that, governors or, politicians overstepping their bounds. They've been doing that forever. It's the fact that so many ministers, powerful ministers, people who have so much pull in this country, and they just shut down. And it's interesting because Kevin brought up, the Facebook situation. A lot of pastors are content with, well, we'll just have our service on YouTube or Instagram or Facebook. And I've been saying, and I wrote an article in the Epoch Times, early into the pandemic of, do you really think that, the big tech people are actually going to respect the fact that you're preaching and teaching the gospel through their medium? It's not going to work out. So it's interesting that just the pastors have sort of backed down on their First Amendment, and the fact that if this is about salvation, if this is about religion and our way to communicate with God, you would think that there would have been a bigger pushback, which is why I have a lot of respect for, like the guy in Tony Spell in Louisiana, John MacArthur out in California. These guys have really pushed back and sort of set the standard of, okay, if there's a fight, these are the people you need to follow.
Yeah. Well, I want to talk too about kind of the pushback on all this too, because we're seeing an interesting phenomena take place, and everyone who's watched the show has known I've been talking about quite a bit, but it's states pushing back. And it's interesting because I think we're seeing the genius of the founding fathers right about now, that they did put into place ways for, let's say, different elements of our government, whether it's state or different branches of government, to really fight back against overreach of government. And we're seeing now that while Democrats have a supermajority pretty much, and the Supreme Court's arguably not doing what people might think it would in a lot of regards, we see states really pushing back. And I want to talk to you all about what's happening with states right now. And now, Rick Green, I was curious if you could talk to us about kind of the U.S. powers that have been given to the states. What powers do the states have in the U.S.?
A lot more than they typically use. Most state legislators don't realize they're actually the most powerful players in the federal government under our Constitution if they do their job, if they actually use the tools in the Constitution to do exactly that. Things like an Article 5 Convention of States that can overrule and overturn anything that the federal government does. That's a state legislative power and something that state legislators would do. There's also things they can do individually in their states. Now, I'm not a supporter of what I think leads to anarchy, where each state just does whatever it wants willy-nilly. But I do think that a state should be able to say what you're doing at the federal level is unconstitutional. And while we're appealing that in the federal courts, I think it's the proper place to appeal something like that, but also through an effort to have a convention of states to overturn that. During that appeal process, I think a state should be able to say, we will not participate in that unconstitutional federal law. And so now you've seen Oklahoma, Missouri, so many other states this year in their legislature actually pass laws saying we're going to do that. If they do some sort of gun grab at the federal level, you will not do that in our state. We've had legislation in Texas. My friend Matt Krause has been trying to pass for years that would simply say, you won't use our resources. It's not the same as saying we will arrest you if you come in with a federal officer to take somebody's gun. But it does say you won't use any state resources. So no local law enforcement, no Texas DPS could be used. I think that's a good step as well. So there's a lot of things the states can do. They have not exercised those powers in recent years, but this year, I think a lot of states have awakened, and these legislators are starting to figure out, hey, there's a 10th Amendment. There's a big role for states. That's why we're the United States of America. And that's why we have a wonderful system of federalism that allows for that tension and that push and pull.
Yeah, it's interesting too, because we're seeing the kind of sanctuary state laws backfire a little bit. Of course, they were doing this to Trump with sanctuary states or sanctuary cities, and we're now seeing gun sanctuary cities and things like this as well. So it goes both ways, which has been interesting to watch.
Yeah.
Dustin, I'm curious if you can talk to us about how the founding fathers viewed the idea of separation of powers, because we don't just have one system of power in the U.S. How did the founding fathers view this?
Well, I mean, I think that they viewed it from what they said, what they wrote, what they discussed during the Constitutional Convention of 1787 was this is the best way to keep everyone protected, because the founding fathers, Madison, Washington, Jefferson, they were all talking about faction. Benjamin Franklin said, and faction stems from passion. And like Franklin said, passion, governs, but it doesn't govern wisely. And the thing that they wanted to do was break up the power as much as possible. And they did this brilliantly. It's when they were talking about, okay, how are we going to do Congress? And they decided, okay, if we're going to do the legislature, let's copy what the British do. Let's split it in two. And George Mason even said, look, this House of Representatives, that's going to be the first part of this democratic process. That's going to be the basis of the democratic process. It's going to go straight from the people. And as all the founding fathers always said, the people are the sovereign. And they wanted to split that up. They wanted to say, okay, we'll have the House, we'll have the Senate. And so they can actually check each other, which is a huge thing. And it's interesting, if you read the Constitution, when they're talking about Article 1, that's the longest portion. Article 2 with the executive, that's the second longest. Article 3 is the third longest. And it's interesting when you read through Madison's notes on the Constitutional Convention, that's exactly how they discussed it. They discussed the legislature way more than anything else, and then the executive was second. But they also wanted to give the executive a lot more power than he had with the Articles of Confederation, which he pretty much didn't have any power. And interestingly enough, the legislature really didn't have much power either to enforce things under the Articles of Confederation, which is a huge complaint. You can read the Continentalist by Alexander Hamilton. He's saying, look, if we're in the middle of a war and our states are not helping out, they're not giving soldiers, they're not paying taxes, they're not doing this, how much more are they not going to really do what they need to do in a time of peace? So they wanted to separate the Congress into two houses. They wanted to give a check for the executive, say, look, you're going to run a lot of things, especially from the national affairs situation, but we need to have a check on Congress as well with the veto, which is a huge thing. And people may think, well, you veto and it just goes back and the Congress can repass it. Well, it's a lot harder to pass it with 2/3 majority with both houses, because that's a very rare thing. And then you have the judiciary. If it is not constitutional, that's the thing, is we say the three branches of power. Well, really there are actually 5 branches of power within this republic. You have the legislature, you have the executive, and you have the judicial. And we started doing judicial review after Marbury versus Madison, early 1800s, like right at the turn of the 19th century. And this gave the judicial an opportunity to look over, is this constitutional? Well, how are they going to make that decision? Is it in the Constitution? Is it in the Bill of Rights? And if it isn't, if it goes against that, then that is that 4th check. And the 5th check is us. It is us. It is the sovereign. We are the people. And if the House of Representatives every 2 years, if they're going to screw around, we usher them out. And it's very interesting as well. You can also add a 6th power with the states, because we've got 50 little republics running around, under this federal system. And we're built exactly as the federal system too.
Well, they're supposed to be republics. They've been dictatorships for the last 15 months, but they're supposed to be republics.
Exactly. Yes.
Little,
and you know
little
what's funny is
dictatorships. Little
even
dictatorships.
Texas gets a lot of credit. But
Abbott's been one of the worst dictators in the country. Yeah,
terrible.
Yeah, no, I agree.
Yeah. Well, actually, on that note of Texas, Kevin, Texas has played an interesting role in all this right now because we've seen Texas kind of leading the charge in a way of states standing up against the federal government. I mean, Florida, Arizona to an extent, but Texas is really pretty up there in terms of pushing back. What's happening in Texas in terms of pushing back against federal government overreach?
Well, great question. I just want to say for people tuning in from other states, and as I look at comments, I know there are a lot of you tuning in from other states, not as great as Texas, but still very important to our republic, that you would think that given all the great courage that you see coming from Texas, that it's perfect, and it isn't. I think hopefully we have learned that something about executive overreach during the COVID shutdowns, which were unnecessary and overwrought. But to get to the heart of your question, Josh, and really give some congratulations, especially to our legislators, think about what happened in the recently concluded Texas legislative session and what's trying to happen in the special session as a result of getting some unfinished business on the docket. First of all, one of the first acts that Joe Biden introduced was an executive order on critical race theory. This sounds sort of esoteric and academic, but it's very simple and it's neo-Marxist. It defines each of us according to the color of our skin, as if that's the only thing that matters, or for that matter, as if it matters. And therefore, the state of Texas, along with 24 other states, has passed legislation that, while not perfect, is very good progress toward that. And in fact, a state Senate committee today in the special session made further progress there. It's a really important example because the federal government unfittingly, and I would argue unconstitutionally, spends so much money on education. I happen to think that the U.S. Department of Education shouldn't even exist. This is coming from a former college president and school headmaster.
And it's pretty new. It's pretty new as well. A lot of people don't know.
It is.
Yeah.
It's only 40 years old. And let me tell you, it's not just a dream, it's a nightmare. The second thing is that the Texas has done, I'm just going to highlight three, is we got passed through a few steps of the legislature really important election reform. This is in the national news, and it's really important to connect the dots here. I know we're going to talk about the John Lewis Act, what I like to call the Corrupt Politicians Act, that we'll hear more about on Saturday on the anniversary of his death. And God rest his soul, a good man, very wrong-headed, but a good man. But the national Democrats are using Texas House Democrats, my friend Rick Green, former legislator, will appreciate this, as puppets. They're using them as puppets for national political theater, because let me tell you what's going to happen in Texas, whether it's next month or September as we get closer to reapportionment, there will be election reform in Texas, which has this radical idea that if a voter ID is required to vote in person, it should be required to vote with a mail-in ballot. Imagine that. Only 81% of Americans support that idea. Now, fittingly, given these left of center states, the governors and legislators there want to present that as a really radical notion. But let me highlight,
Kevin, though, that's because Texas has so many rural areas where no copiers exist, right? Nobody's.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what the vice president said. Sorry, go ahead. I mean, we don't have copiers in Texas, I guess. Yeah.
I appreciate that. I'm tuning in on rural internet from aptly named Liberty Hill, Texas, where surprisingly we have computers and electricity.
Yeah. He's peddling the electricity under his desk.
Yeah. I might have to. Let me
Kevin,
highlight.
go ahead,
No, this is awesome. Let me highlight one other thing close to my heart. In Texas, we love the rule of law and we love immigrants. The history of Texas, more than any other state, I think exemplifies that very diverse peoples can come together and build a vibrant civil society, starting a few hundred years ago all the way to the present day. That's why it just puts us in agony that President Biden and Vice President Harris almost immediately reversed the great progress under the Trump administration about the border crisis. Well, the federal government is not doing its job. Thank goodness our Attorney General, Ken Paxton, has filed suit on this. What did the governor and the legislature do and take an initial step on that I'm hoping they will complete in the next few weeks? They said, we're going to reallocate state funds from one part of the state budget to another so that we can begin completing the border wall system. I happen to believe the best way to spend that ridiculous COVID relief money is to go finish the border wall. That's the kind of thing that the state of Texas is doing, and hopefully other states will follow our lead.
Well, and the interesting thing on this is they actually just made it through the federal government that they're letting states now or cities reallocate the COVID funds, quote unquote COVID funds for law enforcement programs, which, from the same people calling for defunding the police. It's very bizarre what's happening. And so maybe that's a possibility for Texas. We'll have to see. Yeah.
So,
hey, Josh,
on that note,
I don't think Kevin will brag on
too?
himself. So I got to say one thing about Kevin and TPPF, because a lot of people watching, like you said, are outside of Texas. They don't realize that Texas Public Policy Foundation impacts the whole country. These guys are the tip of the spear. Kevin's too modest to say so, but I'm telling you, 20 years ago when I was in the legislature, I used material that they gave me and helped to educate me on issues so that I could vote a conservative vote. And they're doing that for people all over the country. Border wall, all of these issues, they're right there out front. So God bless you, Kevin. I appreciate you guys. Keep up the good work. But I wanted all the non-Texans out there to know you guys don't just help us in Texas. You're actually influencing stuff in other states as well.
Well, that's kind, and I'll compliment everyone tuning in, because we get our courage from all of you. We don't lick our finger, put it up in the wind, and decide what we're going to say. We say, this is right. We're going to go charge the hill, and we'll know there will be millions of Texans and Americans with us.
Amen.
Yeah, just for our viewers as well, if you have questions, leave them in the chat. We'll try to get to them in just a minute. But first, I want to ask our guests again, just kind of broadly, if you have any broader thoughts on, one thing I hear a lot is, can anything be done to, people see the federal government really acting in ways I don't think many of us have ever seen it act. And a lot of people are concerned right now over what they can do. You have a lot of people who are becoming demoralized. We are seeing states push back. I mean, how steady is this? How stable is this?
I'll jump in if nobody else does. Look, I'll say, first of all, on a personal level, everyone watching can do something. Everyone has a voice. Everyone has a duty and a responsibility to get educated on the Constitution and know these documents, the Declaration and Constitution both, and then defend them and vote according to them. Vote for people that will uphold them, not violate them. Unfortunately, though, right now, we don't live under the Constitution in America. We live under the Constitution. They've essentially set the Constitution aside, and those justices are rewriting law for America on a continual basis. So I would say there is hope, and there are methods in the Constitution. One of the reasons I'm such a champion of Convention of States is because what it does is it puts the federal government back in its box. If you're frustrated with the federal government right now, and I am, I'm looking at what they're doing going, wow, we have become a leftist nation almost overnight. The only way to actually fix that long term is not just to send better people to Washington, D.C. You have to fix the system itself. And we got to restore what the founding fathers intended in the Constitution. We got to put the federal government back into those enumerated powers, 17 specific things. And Kevin was right earlier. Department of Education is not one of those 17 enumerated powers. And so we got to use the Constitution.
I'll let the Federal Reserve do that as well. Yeah.
Yeah. There's so many, right? I think I've never done a percentage, but I'm guessing it's probably 40% of the federal government gone overnight if you just fix the Commerce Clause. It's just, anyway. So I just want people to know there are things to do. Don't give up. The system can work if we work it. It's not going to happen overnight. It's going to take time. But that's one reason all three of our organizations, and I'd say all four of our organizations, because what you're doing at Epic Times is just as important. That's why we all do what we do. We're trying to get the people that are out there watching, not just to learn, but to take action. And that's what it's going to take to save the country.
Any other thoughts on that? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, if people are wondering, what to do, you can just look to history. You can look to our history when King George III was doing his thing, just pushing, him in Parliament were pushing all of these acts through. And I'm sure there were a lot of people who thought, what are we going to do? It's the greatest power on earth, i.e. America is the greatest power on earth as of right now. And it's like you can feel helpless, but there were so many who believed in the fact that, hey, we were British citizens. We had British rights, and you are not abiding by these rights. If you firmly believe and understand the Constitution and the rights that you have as an American citizen, then you have every right to stand up and fight back and push back. And I will say this, I think Rick mentioned it, as far as, not sure how many people are on your side. I will say this, most of those revolutions over time, if you look back, even our American Revolution, it was not the majority of people who were pushing for the revolution. Now, from our perspective, in the 1776, and moving forward, you can look at that and be like, oh man, there weren't a whole lot. It was about a third of the people who were really pushing for it. A third, it was like, okay, it'd go either way, and then there were the third that was the loyalists. But if you look at it right now, you're seeing social media, the big tech, you're seeing Hollywood, you're seeing academia, and it seems, and you're even seeing corporate America get on board with this leftist agenda. And from this, just looking at it from the outside looking in, you're like, man, everybody's on board with this. And I can guarantee you that is not the case.
That's right.
Because these are just the big wigs. These are the billionaires, the millionaires. These are the people who, it is the minority that is pushing this, but they have such a large voice because they have gotten into academia, they've gotten into Hollywood, and they've gotten into social media, and big tech. So yes, you're seeing this constant push and push and push, but I can guarantee you that this quasi-revolution that is trying to be pushed forward, it is not the majority. And understand that there is strength in the numbers that you have as an American citizen, knowing, what, there are way more people that stand on the Constitution than don't. So,
yeah, and Kevin, I'm curious, you want to weigh in on that too? What can people do right now, and when it comes to, really kind of, when people feel overwhelmed by the situation, I guess, what would you tell them right now?
Well, I think that Rick and Dustin have offered a lot of wisdom, so listen to what they said. But what I would add to that seems simple, but it's really important. Over the years in the different stops in my career, I've always encouraged people to get more involved, because the greatest sin, if you will, the founders would call this a civic sin, would be apathy. And it speaks directly to what Dustin just said about a third of the people during the revolution going either way. It just depended. It's kind of human nature. But the point is, now is the time when, to Dustin's point, our side outnumbers the other side. The people that we really need to be focused on are not the radical leftists who are not going to listen to us. In fact, they don't even want to give us a platform for our ideas. It's the folks in the middle, and we need to be as cheerful as we can. And I don't say that in some Pollyannish way, but to smile and really try to be appealing, because ultimately truth is on our side. But let me say this one thing, Josh, in answer to your question, this one idea, and it works really well. Ask questions. Ask questions of your school board members. Ask questions of your city council members. Ask questions of your congressman. If we've learned anything in the last month, it's that when parents who are fed up with their school districts being shut down because of COVID unnecessarily, when they get fed up with critical race theory being inserted into their school curricula, when all they do is ask questions, they pierce that bubble. And that really ought to be an inspiration to all of us, that if we're thinking that maybe we aren't smart enough, we aren't well read enough, let me tell you, you are. Just go in there with a smile on your face and start asking questions, and keep asking questions until you get an answer that sounds like the truth.
Yeah, thank you.
Hey, Josh, if I could just comment a couple of things real quick on what Kevin just said. First of all, my Ronald Reagan cup makes me think of what Kevin just said. We need to be happy warriors, just like Ronald Reagan said, happy warriors. And by the way, the other side of this is from the Ronald Reagan Museum. It can be done. So Dustin is right. It can be done. And the numbers, 3% fought in the revolution. That's it. 6 or 7% did something, either served in a legislature or donated in some way supplies or that sort of thing. So it doesn't take that many. And if you're wondering if you're the only one, you're not. We have 8,000 Constitution coaches across the country right now. We got 1,100 classes going right now. Last night, I zoomed into a class in Pennsylvania, of all places, had 500 students going through the class. Tonight, I was on a class, get this, in Seattle, Washington, with 400 in the class. We've got one in LA with 400. I mean, folks, I'm telling you, even in blue America, there are conservative, constitutionalist, God-fearing, freedom-loving folks, and they're fed up and they're getting involved. So you're not alone.
Hey, Josh, I do want to add something to what Rick was saying, because it just came to my mind that this, as terrible as this, lockdown, the pandemic, and the restrictions that have taken place, I have never seen so many people become so aware and so engaged in what the hell does the Constitution say? That is huge. And people are starting to get engaged. So it's great. Like what Rick and Kevin are doing is fantastic. What the Epoch Times is doing is fantastic, because you can tell, like, this is why the Epoch Times is growing so fast. It's because people are engaged. They want to know. And am I supposed to go with this because it doesn't feel right? Well, like, no, it doesn't feel right. And you get one of these. I was reading off of this a little earlier, but you get one of these and just keep it near you and then understand, okay, what are my rights and how can I stand up for them? So this, as bad of a time as it is, it's a great time.
Amen.
Great.
That's good.
Let's go into some questions now. So we have a few questions from the audience, and folks, again, if you have more questions, please leave them in the chat. We'll try to get to them. The first question is for Kevin Roberts, and it's from Gandalf.
Oh, snap.
Yeah, I didn't know he was here.
The gray or the white?
Yeah, that's a good question, actually. It says here, can't Texas suspend the quorum rule when it is so obviously being used to stop governance? What are your thoughts on that, Kevin?
Great question. I'll start and then defer to our former Texas House member in case Gandalf is not aware of Rick Green's prior career.
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
Thanks for the question. First of all, it's great. I've asked myself that question. Just to back up a step for people to know, Texas Democrats have 67 seats out of 150 in the Texas House. You would think, therefore, with 83 seats, that the Texas Republicans would have a quorum, which is understood in most legislative assemblies is 50+1. Well, in fact, the custom in Texas, in fact, the rule in Texas is that it's 2/3. It's 100 out of 150. In part, not entirely, but in part because of our legacy as a southern state. We want to be sure that we protected the rights of the minority party, such that the majority party couldn't just immediately have an assembly and run roughshod over the minority. It's actually, even though it's frustrating because of the politics today, the custom of that is very beautiful and goes back to about 3 or 4 days worth of constitutional debates in Philadelphia. I'll come back to that point before we close. Having said that, I think the time has come to make it 50+1, because we should not allow a handful of Texas Democrats. And let me tell you, it's not all of them. Those of those Texas Democrats who saw President Trump win in their districts, they're not in D.C., and I think they're going to break, and we're eventually going to get election reform. But former Representative Green, that's a long-winded way of pitching this to you.
Well, I'll start off by saying to Gandalf, yes, there's a way to do this. You have to have the ring that unites them all. That's the way to get there. Okay, that was a really nerdy Lord of the Rings answer, but no, listen, Kevin's exactly right. I mean, think about the purpose of this. It's to keep the other side from having a secret meeting suddenly and being able to pass a bunch of stuff without the opposition being able to attend the meeting. That's the real reason you want to have a quorum rule. So I'm actually wondering if we couldn't just adopt something that said, if you purposely break quorum to keep them from being able to do business, or maybe you do it where if notice is given, like we do with committee hearings and that sort of thing, as long as you have a clear notice that they can't break quorum, or it drops to the 50% like Kevin's talking about, there's got to be a way to do better. But this is frankly, a tradition of Democrats. They've been doing this. They did it in 91. They did it 2 months ago in May. Unfortunately, our speaker did not do the call on the House and let them know that they wouldn't be arrested. And so, if your kid throws a tantrum and you give them the cookie, they're going to throw the tantrum again. And so that's why we're back here in July. They did it in 2003, 91, 81, 79 was the killer bees, all the way back to 1870. And Josh, get this, in 1870, they were doing it teaming up with the KKK to keep blacks from voting and to create chaos for the blacks and prevent Reconstruction from being able to take place. That's the history of the Democrats. And I think that's why their rhetoric is so outlandish right now. They're standing at the podium just spewing lies. I mean, let's just be blunt about it. They're saying things that absolutely are not true. And I think, frankly, they're covering up for their own history. When they talk about this as Jim Crow 2.0, they know a lot about Jim Crow since they created it and had white-only primaries in the Democrat primary here in Texas up until the middle of the last century. That's the history of the Democrat Party. So the difference in 1870 was they couldn't get on a jet with Miller Lite and fly off and have a frat party in D.C. So they hid out in a room in the Texas Capitol, and the sergeant at arms had to dive through the window. Literally dove through. It wasn't glass; it was wooden. Dove through the window, rolled into the room, and drug these guys back to the Senate chamber. And some of the senators spent 3 weeks in jail. Now I don't think that'll happen this time. But that's kind of the history of Texas quorum breaking, and it's always been the Democrats. Almost always
they're threatening it. Texas is. I think the legislators, they just voted to arrest them. Actually, so.
Well, they did the call of the House, which is the specific move, and that was 76-4, I think, a couple of days ago. So the sergeant at arms is now empowered to the Constitution says it this way. The Texas Constitution, Article 3, Section 10 says, compel the attendance. So that's meant at times carry them in if you have to. I don't think it'll come to that. Once they come back to Texas, I'd be surprised if it has to come to that. They'll probably end up willingly going to the chamber, and there'll be some sort of deal cut to get them there. But I think Kevin's right. It's time to go to a 50% quorum, at least under these circumstances. If you're not trying to have a secret meeting, everybody knows.
One big thing on this, though, is, what happens if Texas gets rid of quorum, for example, and then they say, oh, well, we can get rid of the filibuster if you want to get rid of quorum. What
isn't that
then?
Ironic that they're using this power to break quorum to go to DC and say that there should be no filibuster? The irony, the hypocrisy, I'm not even sure what the right word is, but
yeah, that's true. You can't beat the irony here. All right, next question is from Bob Brewer. It says, what laws preceded the Constitution and were protected by it? Dustin, do you have any thoughts on that? In terms, because the Constitution does lay out the form of government we have. What laws were preceded by it and were still protected by it after it was passed?
Like what laws preceded the Constitution that supersedes the Constitution? I'm assuming that's what he.
I assume he means that. Of course, we had the Articles of Confederacy,
right?
The American Confederacy prior to this, and they kept some of those in place to an extent, but it was more states. But
yeah,
what are your thoughts on this?
Well, I mean, when they passed the Constitution, that was the idea. Was they were coming together to say, look, the Articles of Confederation, or the AOC, as I like to call it, is not working. So we're going to Constitution, and this is how we're going to run the government. Yeah, I mean, they kept some things from the Articles of Confederation, but that doesn't mean that those laws supersede the Constitution as it stands. Whatever is in the Constitution and whatever moves after the Constitution, that is what is protected. And as long as those laws line up with the Constitution, although we've had laws even recently that don't, anything beforehand, those aren't protected. Like everything started that clean slate in 1789 once everything was ratified, and so there is no going back. You can go back from a historical perspective, and if it's interesting, you can read in the notes they were wanting to figure out, okay, what is this terminology? And they went to Blackstone's commentaries and okay, we're totally going in the wrong direction because we've written this out and it doesn't mean exactly what we think it means. So yeah, you can look back and see, okay, what exactly were they thinking when they wrote these laws? But as far as anything preceding the Constitution and still standing as superseding, no, there's nothing like that.
Well, the real funny thing is actually going back and reading some of the founding documents is that the founding fathers almost didn't even write a Bill of Rights.
Right. Yeah.
It was added in later, but it was because the way the government was actually set up, which we've deviated from quite a bit, was that the government was limited. At least federal government was limited with the boundaries of what was written in the Constitution. They said there's no risk of these rights being taken because they don't have the ability to do it. I'm curious.
Right. I felt like it was repetitive. Really.
On that.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, Rick, do you have more thoughts on that? I'm curious.
Yeah, I was going to say they felt like it was almost repetitive, but thank the good Lord for George Mason and the Virginia Declaration of Rights and ultimately getting it in there in the first Congress. I would say, and I don't mean to be too esoteric about this, but I do think when in the Declaration they specifically talk about the laws of nature and nature's God, I think they did believe there are certain things that we're not going to have to address here in the Constitution that will still be part of our legal system. The Seventh Amendment does somewhat incorporate the common law, and so there is a lot of common law that continued along with the Constitution. So I wouldn't say that it was a total clean slate, but certainly for the federal government itself, and that's the thing we got to remember: the Constitution was not rewriting, there was very few limitations. If you go to Article 1, Section 8, it tells you what the government, federal government can do. Article 1, Section 9 and Section 10 tell you what the federal government can't do and what the states can't do, but it's very limited in terms of what they're telling the states they can't do. So it was really all about the federal government and giving them only this one little bucket of powers. And then the states were still free to do everything else. That's why the Second Amendment, I'm a big gun guy, but the Second Amendment in the Constitution did not protect you from your state, nor did it protect the First Amendment protect you from your state with regard to the first, with those 5 freedoms in the First Amendment. That's why all of us have in our state constitutions a Second Amendment. It may not be the specifically Second Amendment, but there's similar language about the right to keep and bear arms for the individual. We have freedom of speech in almost every state constitution. So the Constitution was specifically to limit the federal government. The 14th Amendment does then incorporate those protections against the states. And that's why Clarence Thomas's concurring opinion in the McDonald case, a gun case out of Chicago, is so important, because it brings back the history of when the 14th Amendment was adopted and what they really intended to do. And they intended to apply the Bill of Rights to the states. So now we do have that protection from the Constitution. But we didn't have that. The founding fathers didn't think we would need that.
Yeah. Hey, Kevin Roberts, a question for you here from Julie Richards. It says, Trump is fighting for free speech. Would he get further ahead if he fought 230, i.e. Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, that says the federal government can't interfere with the companies that are protected by 230? Jen Psaki, White House press secretary, admitted they tell the Facebook of bad posts. And this actually ties into something I think you mentioned at the beginning of this broadcast, of something that just happened, where it turned out the White House was apparently alerting these social media companies of this. We've seen this happening as well with states and so on as well. What are your thoughts about this? Just real quick, this ties into a broader topic that maybe you can comment on. Because going back to even like the early 1900s, the idea of monopoly was becoming a big argument. And it was actually the conservatives who were trying to figure out how to push back against monopoly, because they didn't like the idea of big business tyranny any more than like the idea of big government tyranny. And this has always been kind of a constitutional crisis, I'd say, especially as big tech and big business really have basically oligarchies or technocracies in some ways, where they can take away our rights. And how does government work within that framework? What are your thoughts on this?
Well, I'll answer two parts. The first part will be very direct to the audience member who asks an excellent question. The answer is yes. We need to be focused on Section 230 reforms. In particular, I'll just be blunt with you. The Facebook and Twitter and companies like them shouldn't have them. I also think that Justice Thomas's dissenting earlier in this term was spot on. I think that basically while these companies are not electrical utilities as federal law understands utilities, they have become something like that, which is called the common carrier law. And let me then make a second part, which answers your question, Josh, and it's a little more detailed, but hopefully not long-winded. And that is to say that there are a lot of well-meaning economists, lawyers, center-right, libertarians who have a hard time understanding how you can actually reform the problem that Facebook and Twitter in particular pose. And it's because they're applying late 19th century understanding of what a monopoly is. And rightly, we have a couple of these folks inside our organization. I welcome their perspective. They just cannot wrap their heads around the fact that this modern problem doesn't fit within that box. It's exactly the way you framed it. Well, in the same way, I can tell you this as a historian, in the late 1800s, the early 20th century, the late 20th century, we have always struggled as a people with the regulation of monopolies, because there is a phase as those companies become monopolies that they were just using the free market. We're now at the point where I think Facebook and Twitter are enemies of the state. I think Google's the biggest enemy of the state. I think Apple, unfortunately, I have to hide the Apple computer behind me. It's off. I don't use it. But, and I just want to conclude with this, and hopefully to give you all some courage. Every time I make a statement about that publicly, Google contacts me, Facebook contacts me, Twitter hasn't contacted me, trying to buy off the Texas Public Policy Foundation. Wow. There are some conservative groups that have been bought off. And let me tell you, we aren't for sale, and we never will be, and we're coming after you.
Hey, question for you here, Rick Green. This is from John Lovin. It says, why don't we use the Fifth Amendment grand jury to rein in the federal government? What are your thoughts about that?
Well, first of all, Kevin, you hit it out of the park right there. I couldn't agree with you more. And I was one of those guys. I'm telling you, I struggled with this thing because I'm such a free market guy. And it's been so hard for me to realize that. So I was really relating to what you were saying. It's been so hard for me to wrap my head around the fact that they're utilities. I mean, if I don't want my phone company to eavesdrop on my call and say, oh, we don't like what you're saying, we're going to disconnect you and disconnect your phone, then I also should not want Facebook or Twitter to be able to do the things that they've been doing. So I think you're 100% right, and I'm so glad TPPF has taken that position. But I had to be drug along to get there, so I totally get what you were saying. I'm sorry, I missed what the Fifth Amendment question was. I will say, I wish the Fifth Amendment would be used to compensate people for the government taking of their business. I guess you could argue that's what the PPP funds were, but this business of government, literally shutting people down and keeping healthy people at home. There ought to be some sort of Fifth Amendment claim there somewhere. But you said that they asked something about reining in the federal.
I think they're saying, basically, why don't we invoke the Fifth Amendment to rein in the federal government? And when we talk about, I think this is the Convention of States question.
Oh, they may mean Article 5. Yeah, they might mean.
I think they mean Article 5.
Yeah. I wish we would. I mean, this is the most powerful tool in the Constitution. We've never used it. There's a movement going right now. 15 states have called for it. You need 34 total before you'd actually have it. I used to be against this. I was one of those that was afraid of a runaway convention because I didn't understand the safety valve and the fact that whatever happens at the convention is just a proposal, no different than if Congress proposes an amendment and then it has to go back to all the states and 38 of them have to ratify it. So now I'm very comfortable with it based on that safety valve. And frankly, it is the only, I've become so passionate about this. I'm convinced we can't save the republic without it. If we don't get the federal government out of our daily lives and let Texas be Texas, let California be goofy if it wants to, let other state, let each state do whatever it wants to do, and stop trying to make us the Marxist idea is you make everybody the same. That is not the American way. We need to be able to be free in our individual states. And if they want to think that men have female parts and women have male parts, okay, we'll let them do that. But by golly, we ought to be able to choose differently here in Texas. And the federal government should not be making those kind of decisions. And that's what a Convention of States Article 5 would do, is push the feds back. Kevin could speak to this better than I could, but the founders' view was that the federal government would do external things and the states would do internal things. And what we've done is we've let the federal government get into everything. We no longer ask this very basic question. Every politician in the country, every elected official in the country should always ask, do I have authority to consider the proposal before me when a bill comes to them? Do I have jurisdiction? We don't do that anymore. The feds think they have jurisdiction on everything. State legislators think they have jurisdiction on everything. And that's not true. Consent of the governed. They should only do the things that only government can do and that we, the people, have empowered them to do. We are not a pure republic. We are certainly not a pure democracy. We're a constitutional republic, and we need to get back to that concept of boundaries, authority, and jurisdiction.
Yeah, I love it. Now, last question, we'll go over some more of the panel, but this is from Vicky Vetiri. She said, how best to stop the progressives from their attempts to remove pieces of our history, pull books from school libraries, implementing critical race theory under the guise of equity and inclusion? Dustin, I'm curious if you have any thoughts on how to, what's the best way to, I think, protect our history from being altered, essentially?
Well, I think the best way to do it, and I think Vicky's talking about, and hello, Vicky, she's a big fan of the show. Appreciate it. Appreciate the comment or the question. Getting involved. I'm pretty sure she's talking about the schools, what's going on in the schools, which has been going on for a long time. It's been a slow, just a slow degradation of history, of civics. What schools, really teach civics anymore? But it is the parents getting involved in the school boards. And this is another thing that I was saying. This is a great moment in American history because you're seeing a lot of parents waking up to what is going on. We're like, oh my God, these types of things cannot be taught, or why isn't this being taught in the schools? And so it is getting involved in the school boards. It is going to those meetings. It is getting involved with the teachers, not badgering them or belittling them, but showing actual concern for your child and for the students at large. And also another thing that you can do is, however many students they have in the school is how much they're going to get paid. And so you take your kids out of the school, and if you're like, well, I don't really have any money to send them to a private school, then homeschool them. I will tell you this, as bad as YouTube is, and as much as they censor and everything, There is so much information on YouTube. There's so much information online where they've got all this curriculum put together to teach students in a way that far surpasses what the public schools are doing. And look, private schools are getting involved in some of this crazy stuff too. I think you had one in New York the other day where they're teaching, sort of like just pornographic type of stuff to little kids. So parents have got to get involved. They've got to flip out to an extent. And some of that flipping out needs to be, hey, I'm getting my kid out of this school. And you know what? Let's get some of the other parents together. Let's get them out of the school as well. Another way to ensure that your kid is not being taught wrong history or just bad stuff. We've thrown in Marx and we've thrown in Lenin. We've thrown in that type of stuff, to ensure that they're not being taught that. You yourself need to know the history of things. So you're not duped. I will tell you this. I've had a lot of people ask me, hey, because we'll talk about Howard Zinn, every so often. Like, is a people's history of the United States any good? I'm like, no, it's not. No, it is. He was a commie, and he was writing. And just because Matt Damon likes him doesn't mean it's based in fact. So I would go ahead and abandon that.
Right.
So
that was a Good Will Hunting. I watched that recently. I was shocked that he talks about that in Good Will Hunting. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Rick Green, I know you're kind of on the front lines of this as well. Of course, you did the Patriot Academy. What are your thoughts on the, say, CRT, critical race theory narrative? And I guess what are you doing to kind of push back against that?
Yeah, the great news is this is a winning issue for us. People are hacked off about what's being done. And critical race theories, I mean, it's evil. It's divisive. It's destructive. Ron DeSantis said it best a few weeks back at the Florida Homeschool Convention when I had a chance to tag team with him. And he said, look, this not only teaches our kids to hate their own nation and teach them to hate each other, it teaches them to hate themselves. It's a horrible thing. It's poison. Look, Dustin's right. It's been done for decades. It started at the college campuses and the professors just kind of, dabbling with it themselves. And then our kids started coming home with it. Now it's in our elementary schools. It's evil and wrong. But here's the good news. You can take over school boards. You can turn this around. You can get that out of the schools. I completely agree. I'm a big homeschool dad myself. We homeschooled all 4 of our kids. We encourage people to homeschool. Not everybody can do that necessarily. And 80% of the kids are still going to come through the public schools. So we're very involved in public, private, and homeschooling. But we're going to be involved. We're teaming up with Mark Meckler to have a program to get involved in and I think TPPF is going to be a part of this, Kevin, if I remember right. But we want to be involved in every school board race in the country because parents can win those races. Those are the easier races to win, and you can get in there and make a big difference. We're going to take education back. We've let them have it long enough. We've been busy enjoying the blessings of liberty, and the left has been in the trenches changing the culture. It's time for us to get in the fight. And the school boards, that's the number one place we need to be fighting. It can be done. We can win. It's going to take some time, but we've already seen victories. Even last night, that Constitution class that I dialed into, one of the organizers of the class ran for the school board there and won the race. I've seen that over and over and over again. So, yeah, that's the schools, big battle ahead, and we can win that one.
Yeah, I've been seeing a lot too, actually, just talking to people and doing interviews here. There's a big push, I think, to retake the school boards. And I know, Kevin, I guess I wanted you to kind of weigh on that too, because I know you're kind of pushing, you're kind of on the government level, which is, at least in Texas, which is an interesting point. Where do you see things happening on the pushback against critical race theory from your vantage point?
Well, to Rick's point, we're winning. So whether it's that audience member who asked the question or other people who might think that you're pessimistic because of this, don't be. We're winning. We're winning school board races on this issue. We're going to take back the U.S. House on this issue. We might even have a shot at taking back the U.S. Senate because of this issue. And so what's really important is that this start locally. Go ask questions of your school board members. And if they're giving you the runaround, go run against them. It only takes a couple hundred votes sometimes to win these school board races. We're going to do that in Texas. We don't do elections, but we're going to provide Rick and our friend Mark Meckler with the guide of what you do when you're in the school board. The first thing you do is cut taxes, let me say. But the second thing is at the state level, to the heart of your question, Josh, is you got to pass laws, as the legislature in Texas has done, that requires your state board of education, or whatever it's called, to circumscribe that racism not be taught in schools. Critical race theory is racism. So when you go and ask those questions of your school board member and they say, well, you're just afraid of talking about the ugly periods of history. Oh, no, we're not. The critical race theory is exactly what Rick said. And there are a number of guides, including on our website, that point that out. But let me finish with this, and hopefully I will be correct in my optimism here.
And real briefly for audience too, Kevin is also he majored in African American studies. He knows what he's talking about here. Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry. Yeah,
no, sometimes people would look at me a little funny that you're in African American studies. Nonetheless, love the field because it's important, and you don't have to be African American to love African American history. That's kind of the point about America. But to sum up, I would say President Biden and Vice President Harris planted a landmine. And it's an underappreciated, very important executive order, underappreciated in its significance. And basically, it mandates critical race theory be taught in every university that receives federal funding, which is almost all of them, except the one that I led, Wyoming Catholic College, because we didn't do business with the federal government. But the point is that Texas Public Policy Foundation planted a landmine under the landmine, and we're going to file suit against them, and we're going to win, because all those Trump judges that got confirmed, we're going to file suit in a place where that Trump judge overturns it. So all of that to say, listen to what Rick has said, listen to what Dustin has said in terms of encouragement. Keep pressing on this issue. We're going to take the country back because the left is overreached.
Real briefly, there's a question from Bob Brewer. Says, Josh, are you celebrating Constitution Week this year? Every week is Constitution Week for me. And all right, and last question, we'll go into some more. This is from CJ Kramer. It says, can I individually secede into Texas if I consider myself a sovereign citizen? Rick, why don't you take that one? What are your thoughts?
Kevin and Dustin and I, when this is over, we're going to create a Texas citizenship test, and so anybody moving to Texas is going to have to take it to get in.
Beautiful.
Hey, if you're for freedom and liberty and upholding the Constitution and having moral values and all of those things, and you love the flag and you want America to be better and all that, we want you. We've actually been blessed, I think, with a lot of the people that have moved in from California and other states. We've been getting the more conservative folks from those areas. Ted Cruz did better with the transplants, and O'Rourke did better with the Texans, which shocked me. But yeah, if you do move to Texas, help us make it more red and more conservative. Don't try to change it to blue. One thing on what Kevin was saying, school choice is the other thing I think we're probably all for on this call. And I think legislatively, we need to be pushing our legislators. And now that people are so angry with what the public schools have been doing, and now that they saw during COVID some of the things that are happening, I'm hoping we finally get the momentum to get more and more school choice, both here in Texas and across the country. That will help a lot to get better curriculum into the schools, because competition always improves things.
Now, we're going through time pretty quick here. Jesus, we almost need like 2 hours for you guys, but
hey, I'm here all night. So.
Oh yeah, there we go. Just briefly, I want to talk briefly about the difference between a constitutional republic and democracy, because everybody says that we're a democracy. We're not we're not a republic, right? They don't even mention republic. It's still in our Pledge of Allegiance, but nobody talks about America being a republic anymore. They said our democracy, our democracy. Real briefly, Rick, can you tell us what's the difference between a republic and a democracy?
Yeah, I don't know if anybody else was as annoyed by Schumer and Biden and all the speeches over the last couple of days about, the horrible voter integrity laws that we're going to destroy our democracy that doesn't even exist. And I get they might be using that in a generic term, but the founders hated democracy. They called it a mobocracy. They called it one of the greatest of evils, and that it always ends in violence. So, like we said earlier, we're not even just a pure republic. We're a constitutional republic. And that's so important because we were founded with this understanding of what theologically we consider to be the depravity of man, that man is not inherently good. He's inherently evil. And so you have to bind him down with the chains of the Constitution, as Jefferson would say. And so we really limit how far even the good guys can go. So even when you elect somebody that you think is going to be great, you don't want to just send them off to Washington and say, hey, do whatever you think is best, unlimited. You want to say, do whatever you think is best within these boundaries. And that's really the difference between a republic and a constitutional republic. And then democracy. If we were a pure democracy, that would mean we're all getting online and voting on every issue, which would become mobocracy, because there's no way everybody's going to be able to go study the issues, cast an informed vote, pay attention to what's happening. And then it would be finger to the wind. There'd be none of the checks and balances or the buffers that help to have that deliberative body. Our founders were geniuses. I really believe that. I mean, as students of history, as students of theology, God used these imperfect men to create this incredible system. Kevin said it at the beginning of the program. It's not perfect, but man, it's the best one we've ever had. And like I think it was Franklin that said it's the worst form of government other than every other one. It really is the best one that we've seen, and we need to salvage it.
Yeah, if you're gonna have to have government, might as well choose the least bad of the bunch, right?
That's right.
You always. It's actually funny how anti-government the founding fathers were in a lot of ways. Just if you read them, it's almost funny if you read them these days.
They had a healthy distrust, right? Madison put it that way.
They did.
He said the reason they limited the powers because we have a distrust of government. Yeah.
I mean, a lot of them are really opposed to forming a federal government, which was interesting. All right, I want to jump ahead a bit just because we are running low on time, but I want to talk about, really what America represents, because we could talk about all the attacks on this country. We could talk about all the narratives against it, but really America has been an anomaly when it comes to history. It's something really unique on the stage of history. I think people, a lot, especially the education systems these days, it's not really appreciated what America is and how different it was from a lot of other governments that have existed, through history. And Dustin, I'm curious, you can tell us how the American system kind of fits into this world story.
I think it's really just like a new chapter. I mean, we did things that were so different as far as just an individual thing. But what's interesting is that we did a lot of the things that previous governments did, but the best things of those, if you read through the Founding Father documents and what they wrote and what they said, you will find that they discussed, the Roman Republic, the Greek democracy, the German Confederacy, the Polish Diet. They discussed all of these things, and obviously England as well, and even Israel. There's a guy, Russell Kirk, wrote a great book, The Roots of American Order, which I encourage everybody to read. But the thing is that the Founding Fathers took the best of what was done, and they learned from what bad things were done, which is why, what Rick was saying was the mobocracy. James Madison said, in Greece, even if everyone was a Socrates, the mob, it would have still been a mob. Even if everybody was brilliant and genius, it's called passion. It's called, I want what I want. And that was the danger that Madison talked about in Federalist Paper number 10 was, hey, they're violent in their deaths. They're just not going to work out because it is the tyranny of the 51%. So if I win, good luck keeping whatever it is that you have, whether that's right, whether that's property. And so what we did, and I mentioned this at the beginning, how religion and government were intertwined you can go back thousands of years, and this was pretty much always the case, whether it was a pagan religion or whether it was Christian and Islam or any other religion. It was always the government and religion hand in hand. Well, we changed that. We said, you know what, we're going to keep those two separated. Now, obviously the Thomas Jefferson statement that everybody likes to go around thinking that, separation of church and state is in the First Amendment. Well, it's not really. You got to really break that down. But they thought that through. They said, we cannot have this church or the religion, more or less dictating people's lives, because that we've seen from thousands of years of experience how that works out. And the republic is as Benjamin Franklin and our good friend Rick, mentioned, this is the best way to put the government together. And it's so broken up. That's another thing that's so unique. It is so broken up. The powers are so broken up. And the only way for a republic to actually exist and thrive over such a massive landscape and over so many people is to have broken it up into 50 republics. and have this federal system. And like Kevin and Rick were saying, there's a real problem that we're running into because the federal overreach is wanting to take over everything. And it's one of the things that the founding fathers said, look, if you're going to have it all centralized, you might as well get rid of all the borders and just have one country and no states.
Now, Kevin, I'm curious, in your eyes, what has America really been for the world? How has the United States really impacted the world?
Well, you and Dustin are both right in saying that America is unique. I mean, by definition, one of a kind. There has never been in the history of the world a nation like ours. And I want to be really specific about what it's done. Dustin spoke eloquently about some of the mechanics of it, and those are very important. I want to be a little more abstract, but hopefully understandable, even though I am a recovering academic. And that is that America achieved, because it's a constitutional republic, of taking two competing aims, order and liberty, and putting them in perfect balance. So that when we're exercising our freedom, we're not doing freedom as, maybe a millennial might say today, the freedom to do whatever the heck I want, the freedom to do what I ought, which confers a moral obligation to another and to the civil society. And so the point, Josh, is that America would give a lot to the world if all it did was show how through a constitution and a republic, you put order and liberty together. And if you look at the diffused powers, as Dustin explains, but it's even more important than that in two ways. The first is that kind of system requires of us, as de Tocqueville would remind us, in fact, it inspires us, it ought to higher virtue, not just the personal virtue we have to be good men and good women, but also to exercise that virtue as voters, as representatives of our constituents. Keep that in mind the next time you're voting. But the second thing is really important, and perhaps this comes from my specific study of history. That all would be unique. But we, of course, are Americans. We're ambitious. We added another layer on top of that. We are so pluralistic in the best sense of that term. We didn't create a theocracy. We didn't create a country where one class is favored over another. We are a country with a history of slavery, but we're also the only country whose very own founding documents were the basis of ending slavery and the basis of equal rights 100 years later. These are things that ought to make us proud. And if you go to any place in the country, just ask people who are trying to free Cuba right now, just ask them, what's the model? It's America. What's the icon? The American flag.
Yeah.
That's good.
Just last question on this. Rick Green, I was wondering if you can talk about this because, through the 20th century, America has really been kind of, of course, Kevin just mentioned, when it comes to Cuba right now, they're waving the American flag. That's right. It symbolizes something. You saw the same thing in Hong Kong. They were waving the American flag because America represents something for the world. And I'm curious, in your eyes, what would the world lose if this symbol of America was lost?
Well, just imagine what the world would look like if there had been no America. We've been the beacon of light. We've been the exporter of freedom around the world. And, I'm a country boy. I just always use the country boy test when people today question whether or not America is worth saving. I say, look, are people trying to get in? Or are they trying to get out? This is still the place that everybody wants to come. Red, white, yellow, black, or brown. They want to come to America because we are the example of the most freedom, the most prosperity, the most benevolence. I mean, that's one we leave out often. We've been the most benevolent nation in history, always helping others, other nations, and coming to their aid. We had the bomb in 1945. We could have controlled the entire planet. We were the first nation in history to have that technological advantage in war, and we didn't conquer our neighbors. We freed our neighbors. We freed and liberated others, and then we took our money and went and rebuilt the nations that had attacked us. There's something different about the American story, and it goes back to the founding we've been talking about tonight. It goes back to that theological understanding that the founding fathers had, but also, as Dustin said, studying every form of government and all of those histories, and they put together the best of the best. Without America, man, I don't know where we go. I think about Reagan's speech in 1964, or the speech, and how he talked about if we don't have it in America, we could be plunged into 1,000 years of darkness. I know that sounds like hyperbole. It sounds like crazy talk, but I mean, in reality, if you didn't have America on the world scene, what would the world look like? It'd be a scary place for sure. And instead of being the example of what to do, lately we've become the example of what not to do. So we've got to reverse this, not just for us, but for the entire world. And I want to leave you with one other thing, because Washington was looking out at the world in his farewell address and thinking these same things that we're talking about right now. And he was watching the French Revolution, and he was watching the French try to get what we had. But the French left something out. They wanted libertas. And it's just like what Kevin was just describing. It was that idea of liberty to do anything and everything that you want, instead of having that goodness and that virtue and that order balanced with it. And Washington warned the nation at that time in his farewell address. He said that religion and morality are indispensable supports of political prosperity. So if we want our nation to succeed and prosper, he said religion and morality have to be at the heart of it. Why? Because you can't have liberty without morality, and you can't have morality without religion. And then he said, in vain would that man claim the tribute of patriotism that would work to subvert these great pillars. So as we have a new revolution in our country and we want freedom and we're fighting for freedom, let's not forget that balance that comes from having religion and morality at the heart of who we are, so that we're driven by goodness. We're driven to live freedom, respecting the authority of the source of that freedom, which is God, and respecting our fellow man. That's the kind of America that, frankly, our grandparents meant to leave us. Right now, it's not the kind of America that we're leaving our kids, but we can do something about that. We can reverse that.
Great. Now, I guess just wrapping up, for any of our guests, any last thoughts on any part of this discussion we've had? Anything you want to say, or anything you feel we missed that you want to mention?
Real quickly, to sum up the encouragement we've given all of you in the audience. I fought the academic left, have fought them for 25 years as a conservative Christian historian. And one thing I can tell you they do is they always overreach, and they always count on us being pessimistic. They always count on us throwing in the towel. I hope what you've heard tonight, I hope what you have been inspired by with what Dustin is doing and Rick is doing and what Josh and his colleagues at the Epoch Times are doing is encouragement. If you don't do that, we're going to win, because truth is on our side, and America is worth fighting for even today.
Yeah, thank you, Kevin. Any other thoughts, folks? Anyone?
Man, just be active. Don't sit on the sidelines. And just like Kevin said, don't grow weary in well-doing. Don't give up. No matter how long this fight takes, it's worth it. And maybe ask yourself the question, what's your freedom worth? And even more importantly, what's your child's freedom worth? I know what my grandchild and my children and my grandchildren's freedom is worth. And that's why we do this every day. And everybody that's watching, you can play a part in this.
Yeah, thank you.
I would say that, just if you want inspiration, look to history, look to what is, taken place over the years, even just in this country. There's so many things that, you can find, so much inspiration from American citizens that have overcome odds, and we've got a lot of odds facing us, but also engage with your kids. Parents, please engage with your kids. Grandparents, please engage with your grandkids on what the truth of this country is, because there's so many. I have found that there's so many just people who focus their knowledge on slogans and famous phrases, but they don't really know what they're talking about, and you will find it. Don't be intimidated when somebody says, "Oh yeah, well this and this." Once you pry that a little bit, you will realize that's a house of cards, and it pretty much always falls apart because they really don't know what they're talking about. They're just taking slogans and repeating them.
Yeah. Thank you all. Well, folks, as we've been talking about the Constitution, our rights are kind of under assault, but there's a lot of hope with it too, because the way the founding fathers built this country and established constituted our system of government with the Constitution, which is the basis of our government, is really something unique. And it was really built to withstand tyranny. I mean, this is what the founding fathers were trying to do. They were trying to create something that could prevent and withstand attempts to create tyranny. And with this said, there's a lot going on, a lot of pushback going on, and really a lot of things to be hopeful about, as our guests have mentioned tonight. And so again, thanks everyone for joining. Real pleasure having you all here. If you haven't watched the documentary we did too, America Rewritten, all of our guests here were in that documentary. And so thanks again to y'all for that as well. And that said, folks, thanks again to our guests, Dustin Bass, Kevin Roberts, Rick Green. Real pleasure having you all on. Thank you.
Thanks, Josh.
For having me.
Yeah, and real quick too, folks, those of you watching Epoch TV, thank you as well. Our live chat is back. It was briefly offline. We were, we're building the platform from the ground up, and so it took a little bit of time, but you can follow us on there again. We do have the live chat up, and thanks everyone for being there. All All right, folks, that said, appreciate you all. Thanks again. And as always, take care of yourselves, stay informed, and stay free. Thank you. The American story was once seen as a light of strength and freedom for the world. It created a government by the people and for the people, where rights were given not by leaders, but by God. Yet now the very fabric of the nation is under assault.
Without us, I don't think you'd have free market capitalism. I can't think where it exists in its essence anywhere else.
I think the American idea is forward-looking, it's optimistic, it's the idea that children will live better than their parents.
The Constitution mostly is a guarantee of what government cannot do.
If we lose the Constitution, we lose our liberty, we lose our prosperity, we lose our way of life, and the world loses because the world has been depending on us for a half century.
So every tyrant in America right now, from the radical left to the globalists to big tech to the Communist Party of China, are all trying to destroy the US Constitution. Because if they can do that, they have complete power over every aspect of our lives. That's their dream, and that's our nightmare.
What is the real story of America? Why did the Founding Fathers choose a republic over a democracy? And what would the world be if the bedrock of the American Constitution was lost?